The brutal murder of 6-year-old Fawn O'Neill isn't just a story. It's a nightmare no child should have to endure. A little girl, full of life and innocence, was taken in the most horrifying way imaginable, and was at the hands of someone who should have protected her. Fawn O'Neill was just 6 years old, a precious little girl who loved like any other child. But in the blink of an eye, her world was shattered. Her life was brutally cut short by someone she should have been able to trust. Justin Ferguson, her mother's boyfriend, made a choice, one that would change the course of Fawn's life forever. This is no ordinary story. This is a story of unimaginable heartbreak. A little girl, full of laughter and life, was stolen away by someone who was supposed to care for her. As we uncover the truth, we will peel back the layers of a crime so monstrous, it's hard to believe it could happen in our own world. If you don't hit subscribe now, you might just forget this little girl's name. Don't let her story be forgotten. You owe it to her. Fawn O'Neill was a 6-year-old girl full of life and wonder, just beginning to discover the world around her. Her days were filled with innocent joys, the kind of joys that only a child can experience so fully. She had a laugh that could light up a room, and a smile that melted the hearts of those around her. For Fawn, the world was a playground, a place of endless adventure, where every day held the promise of something new. She loved the simple things that many of us take for granted. The feel of a warm blanket after a long day, the joy of play with her favorite stuffed animals, and the comfort of being held by those she trusted. One of Fawn's most cherished belongings was her beloved stuffed bear, a constant companion who went with her everywhere. She would talk to it as if it were a real person, sharing her thoughts and dreams. She would dress it in doll clothes, imagining that it had its own life and adventures. Fawn's love for her bear wasn't just about the toy itself. It was her way of expressing the pure, unfiltered love that flowed from her heart. At night, she would curl up with it, and her mother, Jessica, would tuck her in, whispering good night with a soft kiss on her forehead. These moments, though simple, were what made Fawn's childhood so special, moments of warm comfort and love that any child should have. But beyond her stuffed bear, Fawn also had a lively curiosity about the world. She enjoyed arts and crafts, especially drawing and coloring. She was fascinated by bright colors and would often spend hours sketching pictures of animals and flowers. Her crayons were her tools, her creativity her outlet. She was often found in the corner of the living room, sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by paper and drawings. Her artwork was vibrant, full of the innocence and hope that every child carries within them. Fawn's parents often praised her artistic ability, and it was clear that she had a natural talent that, had things been different, could have flourished as she grew. Fawn's mother, Jessica O'Neill, was a young woman with a complex past. Before Fawn was born, Jessica had been through a series of difficult relationships. She was no stranger to hardship, and her relationship with Fawn's father had been marked by instability. Jessica had dreams of a better life, but they were often overshadowed by the harsh reality she faced. She moved around a lot, never quite finding a place to call home. The family's financial situation was unstable at best. Jessica worked various jobs, but it seemed like there was always more month than money. She struggled to make ends meet and provide the stability that Fawn needed. Despite the challenges, Jessica and Fawn shared a strong bond. They were close, closer than many mother-daughter relationships. Fawn looked up to Jessica, and Jessica, despite the difficulties she faced, did her best to provide love and care for her daughter. The two of them spent time together, with Jessica taking Fawn to the park or playing dress-up with her. There were moments of joy, and for a while, it seemed like they had a strong, loving connection. But there were cracks in their lives that Fawn could not see, cracks that would ultimately lead to a tragedy neither of them deserved. Though Fawn was still so young, there were signs that the stability she needed was slipping away. Ferguson's presence in their home introduced a level of tension that hadn't been there before. He was charming at first, just like many abusers are. He would buy a small gift for Fawn, trying to win her over with toys or treats. For a while, he seemed like a welcome addition to their little family. But Jessica's friends and family started noticing subtle shifts in her behavior. She became withdrawn, more distant from Fawn and those who cared about her. She started to excuse Ferguson's increasingly aggressive behavior, chalking it up to stress or a bad day. But the signs were clear to anyone who was paying attention. Fawn's once happy and carefree days were now clouded by the unpredictability of Ferguson's moods. Fawn began to show signs of stress that she hadn't before. She was quieter, more reserved, and sometimes seemed afraid to speak up. Though she was still a young child, she could sense the tension in the house. If you're watching this and don't feel the need to subscribe yet, think of Fawn. If you don't act now, you're letting this story slip away. Is that what she deserves? Jessica O'Neill's relationship with Justin Ferguson began like many relationships do, full of promise and hope. They met through mutual friends, and at first, Ferguson seemed like the perfect match. He was charming, kind, and full of compliments for Jessica. In the early days, Jessica felt like she found someone who understood her, a man who could offer her the stability and love she had longed for. At first, Ferguson was attentive and affectionate, making Jessica feel special. He showered her with gifts, took her on romantic dates, and made her feel valued. For a while, it seemed like the relationship could be the fresh start Jessica had always wanted. But as time passed, subtle cracks began to form, though they were hard to notice at first. The kindness that initially won Jessica over began to show signs of being conditional, based on her compliance with Ferguson's expectations. As the relationship progressed, Ferguson's behavior began to change. He started to isolate Jessica from her friends and family, subtly making her feel that he was the only one who truly cared about her. He would suggest that her friends didn't understand her, or that her family was unsupportive. Jessica, seeking the validation that had always been lacking in her life, slowly pulled away from those closest to her, finding solace in Ferguson's assurances. What she didn't realize was that this was the beginning of emotional control, an insidious tactic that would soon tighten its grip on her. Ferguson began to show signs of anger over small, insignificant things. At first, it was just moments of irritation, snapping at Jessica for being late, or getting upset if she didn't do something exactly as he wanted. These moments were brief but jarring. Jessica tried to brush them off, attributing them to stress or a bad day. But the pattern began to emerge slowly. The more she accommodated Ferguson's demands, the more volatile his mood swings became. The charm he initially showed started to give way to emotional manipulation, and soon, Jessica began to feel like she was walking on eggshells around him. As the relationship deepened, Ferguson's behavior grew more aggressive, but in ways that Jessica had trouble recognizing as abusive. There were no overt signs of physical violence at first, but the emotional abuse was growing stronger. Ferguson often belittled Jessica in private, calling her names and making her feel worthless. He would criticize her appearance, her intelligence, and even her parenting. These insults came slowly, almost like a whisper, undermining her self-esteem little by little. Over time, Ferguson became increasingly controlling, trying to dictate what Jessica could wear, where she could go, and even who she could talk to. If she made a decision without consulting him, it would lead to an argument, sometimes turning into a full-blown confrontation. There were moments when Ferguson's rage seemed to boil over, and Jessica would be left feeling confused, asking herself, "What did I do wrong?" The emotional scars started to accumulate, but they were invisible, hidden beneath a facade of normalcy. Fawn, too, began to feel the effect of Ferguson's presence in their home. She wasn't yet old enough to understand complexities of adult relationships, but she could sense the tension in the house. She became more withdrawn, quieter than before. The once vibrant little girl who loved to color and play with her stuffed animals now spent more time in silence, retreating into herself. Jessica noticed these changes but failed to connect the dots, blinded by her need to please Ferguson and maintain the fragile peace in their home. The most damaging aspect of Jessica and Ferguson's relationship was the psychological manipulation that took place. Ferguson didn't just control Jessica through force or anger. He used her vulnerabilities against her. He knew she had been through difficult relationships in the past, and he preyed on her insecurities. He made her believe that she was lucky to have him, that she was nothing without him. He made her feel as though she had no one else to turn to, that no one would love her the way he did. As Ferguson's control over Jessica grew, so did his power. He played on her fears of being alone, of being abandoned. He made her believe that if she left him, she would never find happiness or someone who would take care of her. This emotional manipulation was subtle yet powerful, and it left Jessica feeling trapped in a relationship that she didn't know how to escape. There were moments when Jessica would think about leaving Ferguson, but each time she did, he would pull her back in with promises of change. "I'm sorry," he would say. "I'll do better. I just need you to trust me." The cycle of abuse continued, with Ferguson manipulating Jessica's emotions to keep her in a state of dependency. She began to believe the lies he told her, that he loved her in his own way, and that the abuse was her fault, not his. There were moments when Jessica would think about leaving Ferguson, but each time she did, he would pull her back in with promises of change. "I'm sorry," he would say. "I'll do better. I just need you to trust me." The cycle of abuse continued, with Ferguson manipulating Jessica's emotions to keep her in a state of dependency. She began to believe the lies he told her, that he loved her in his own way, and that the abuse was her fault, not his. Despite the occasional outbursts from her family, who encouraged her to leave him, Jessica stayed. She felt as if she couldn't survive without Ferguson. She would never admit it to herself, but she feared that without him, she would be nothing, no one. And so, she stayed, thinking that the love she had for Fawn and the hope that things would improve were enough to carry them through. The signs were there, but they were ignored. Don't ignore Fawn's story. Subscribe now so you don't become part of the problem of turning a blind eye. It was an ordinary day, or at least it seemed that way at first. Fawn had woken up, just like any other morning, with the promise of a day filled with innocence and joy. Her eyes sparkled as she got ready for school, brushing her hair and slipping into her favorite outfit, a playful dress with bright colors that made her feel happy. Fawn's mother, Jessica, was preoccupied with her own thoughts, likely consumed by the growing tension in her relationship with Ferguson. There was something about the way the day started that felt off, an underlying tension hanging in the air, but Jessica, lost in the rhythm of daily life, didn't acknowledge it. Fawn went to school as usual, perhaps carrying with her an unconscious sense of unease. There were no outward signs of trouble. She wasn't acting differently. She was still the same sweet, lively girl, laughing with her classmates, engaging in her favorite activities, and looking forward to the after-school routine. It was one of those rare moments when everything seemed normal, even though beneath the surface, things were anything but. Ferguson, who had been steadily increasing the tension in their home, had been quiet in the morning but still cast a shadow over the house, his presence unsettling. The morning went by, and by the time Fawn returned home, the storm was building. The house felt different, quieter, yet more charged with an underlying sense of dread. Jessica could sense it, but she chose to ignore it. Focus instead on the mundane chores that filled her day. Ferguson, too, seemed to be lost in his own mood, distant and brooding. It wasn't unusual behavior for him. He'd been volatile in the past, but today there was something sharper, more dangerous in his demeanor. Fawn entered the house after school, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her face bright with the excitement of her day. She was ready to tell her mother about what had happened at school, maybe even show her the drawing she'd worked on. But as she walked in, she was met with silence. No laughter, no joyful greetings. The air was thick with tension. Jessica, on the other hand, tried to keep things normal for Fawn. She offered a smile, though it was strained, trying to keep the peace with Ferguson. But no words could bridge the gap that had widened between them, and there was an almost palpable silence hanging in the house. As the day wore on, the tension continued to build, with Ferguson's anger simmering just beneath the surface. He began to grow more impatient and critical of Jessica, his irritability noticeable. A few words exchanged between them in the kitchen escalated quickly, like so many other times before, but this time the threat of violence felt much closer. Fawn, aware of the rising storm but still too young to fully understand it, tried to find comfort in the things she loved. She played with her stuffed bear, the same one she carried around since she was a toddler, trying to keep the creeping fear at bay. But it was hard to ignore the tension when her mother's eyes darted nervously toward Ferguson, and when Ferguson's angry mutterings filled the silence. Jessica, perhaps sensing that something was about to snap, tried to keep her distance from Ferguson. She knew that there had been arguments before, but nothing had ever reached this point. Nothing that felt so dangerous. There were flashes of memory in Jessica's mind. The quiet warnings from friends, the concerned looks from her family, but she couldn't bring herself to act. She was trapped in the toxic cycle of the relationship, feeling powerless to stop it, unable to recognize the danger until it was too late. Fawn, still so innocent, was unaware of the gravity of the situation. She continued to play, unaware that the day she'd been looking forward to was rapidly spiraling into a nightmare. The once safe environment of her home was now a battleground. Fawn's carefree laughter was now drowned out by Ferguson's loud, irritable voice, followed by long silences. The storm was finally reaching its peak. The final act of violence happened quickly. In a moment of unchecked rage, Ferguson snapped. The altercation that began as a verbal argument between him and Jessica soon escalated, and in that moment, something broke inside him. Without warning, he lashed out at Fawn, his fury too great to control. In a swift and horrifying moment, Fawn's life was tragically cut short. Jessica, shocked and unable to react in time, was paralyzed by the horror of what had just unfolded. Her heart screamed in disbelief, but she couldn't process the magnitude of what had happened. Fawn, who had been nothing but a beacon of innocence, had been silenced forever by the violence that had long been brewing in their home. Fawn's life was taken in cold blood, and here we are, still talking about it. Don't let this be the last time you hear her name. Hit subscribe, or how can we justify the silence? After that quiet afternoon, Fawn was never seen again. What started as a normal day quickly spiraled into a nightmare. When she failed to return home after school, Jessica began to feel a gnawing sense of dread deep in her gut. Fawn had always been punctual. She was reliable, eager to come home after a day filled with schoolwork and play. But this time, Fawn didn't walk through the door. At first, Jessica told herself that Fawn might be caught up in something with a classmate, or perhaps had stayed behind to finish a project at school. But as the minutes turned into hours, the worry started to creep in. She called the school to ask if Fawn had stayed late. Nothing. She called neighbors and friends, but no one had seen her. Panic began to set in, and it didn't take long for Jessica to call the police. The authorities immediately launched a search, mobilizing local law enforcement and volunteers to comb the area. They scoured nearby parks, streets in the neighborhood, looking for any trace of the missing child. Jessica stood at the edge of the search efforts, her hands trembling as she clutched a picture of Fawn, hoping for some sign that her daughter was safe. But hours passed, then a day, and still there was no sign of Fawn. As the search expanded, people in the community began to fear the worst, but the police kept their lips sealed, uncertain if this was a case of an abducted child, a runaway, or something far darker. The police began to question everyone who might have information. Jessica, Ferguson, and anyone who had come into contact with Fawn in the hours before her disappearance. Jessica's mind raced, filled with dread. Could Ferguson have been involved? He was distant, brooding, and had exhibited violent tendencies before, but could he have done something so horrific? The idea seemed impossible to entertain, yet it lingered in the back of her mind. Still, there was no hard evidence, only suspicion. As the hours dragged on, the community gathered, offering whatever help they could. But nothing prepared them for what would come next, the discovery that would forever change everything. The search took days, but as the hours turned to days, the situation became increasingly dire. The police had been working tirelessly, but they had yet to find any sign of Fawn. The thought of her being out there alone, frightened, and lost began to consume Jessica. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, but the question of whether it was a kidnapping or something else was still unanswered. It wasn't until a routine search of the house, prompted by mounting suspicion, that the horrifying truth came to light. Fawn's body was discovered hidden in the attic, a place where no one had thought to look before. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation team, and soon the police had confirmed their worst fears. Fawn had been murdered. The attic, often an out-of-sight, out-of-mind place for most families, became the scene of a grisly discovery. It was quiet there, the air thick with dust. Her tiny body was hidden under old, forgotten boxes and bags, hidden away as if someone had hoped to erase the evidence of the crime. The forensic team arrived, carefully documenting the scene, but the pain was evident in their eyes. They knew this was no accidental death. Police began to piece together the timeline, and as they combed through the evidence, the chilling reality set in. Ferguson had been the last to see Fawn alive. His behavior, once again, seemed off during the questioning. The officers, initially uncertain about the possibility of foul play, now had no doubt. Ferguson, who had shown early signs of violence and emotional instability, was quickly identified as the prime suspect. When the news spread that Fawn had been found dead, it felt like a punch to the gut of the entire community. The tragedy was not just local. It reverberated through everyone who had known and loved Fawn. How could something so horrific happen in their quiet town? How could someone who was trusted to care for her, someone who had been a part of their daily lives, be capable of such evil? Neighbors, friends, and family members who had known Fawn as a vibrant, playful child were left in disbelief. How could this happen to such an innocent soul? They had seen Fawn grow up in the neighborhood, play in the parks, laughing with her friends. To think that this sweet, innocent child was taken so violently left many struggling to make sense of the incomprehensible. There were vigils and public displays of mourning, with the community coming together to honor Fawn's memory. People lit candles in the local park, wrote messages of hope, and shared their memories of the little girl whose life had been stolen. The grief was palpable, but so too was the anger. Anger at the loss of such a bright future, and anger that someone so young had to suffer such a fate. The community, though devastated, rallied around Fawn's family, showing their support and love during this unimaginable time. Fawn's story became a rallying cry for child safety in the community. Many began to speak out against domestic violence and child abuse, realizing how easily something like this could happen if red flags were ignored. The tragic event spurred local organizations to raise awareness about preventing violence and abuse, ensuring that Fawn's death would not be in vain. Fawn's life was taken in cold blood, and here we are, still talking about it. Don't let this be the last time you hear her name. Hit subscribe, or how can we justify the silence? After the devastating discovery of Fawn's body, the police turned their full attention to Justin Ferguson. Despite initially maintaining a degree of suspicion, the investigation had to be methodical. Ferguson, who had been one of the last people seen with Fawn, was not immediately arrested. The police were cautious, unsure whether they had enough evidence to charge him outright. His behavior during questioning was odd. He was evasive, yet his answers seemed rehearsed, as if he were trying to control the narrative. As the days passed and the investigation deepened, more details about Ferguson's violent history came to light. The officers began to piece together the pattern of behavior he had displayed, his emotional instability, his history of abusive relationships, and the increasingly hostile environment he created at home. Investigators started connecting the dots. Fawn had been last seen alive in his presence, and his actions, particularly his attempt to isolate Jessica from her support system, became more suspect. The police eventually gathered enough evidence to secure an arrest warrant for Ferguson. On the morning of his arrest, there was a chilling sense of inevitability. Ferguson was taken into custody quietly, without any dramatic confrontation. The weight of the evidence was clear, and it was only a matter of time before the community's worst fears were realized. Ferguson was indeed involved in Fawn's murder. The arrest was not a moment of celebration. It was a painful acknowledgement that justice had to be served. For Jessica, it marked the beginning of an agonizing journey through the justice system. The trial of Justin Ferguson was a spectacle that captured the attention of the community. It was a case that rattled the local sense of security, a case that no one ever thought would hit so close to home. The courtroom was filled with reporters, community members, and family members, all watching the unfolding legal battle with bated breath. The prosecution's case was clear. They presented a solid timeline of events, connecting Ferguson to Fawn's murder. They brought in key witnesses. Jessica, whose testimony was a gut-wrenching account of the events leading up to Fawn's death, and forensic experts who detailed the evidence found at the crime scene. The forensic evidence, including DNA and forensic analysis of the attic where Fawn was found, was irrefutable. The prosecution also relied heavily on testimony about Ferguson's violent tendencies. They painted a portrait of a man who had manipulated and controlled Jessica emotionally and psychologically, leading up to the crime. Ferguson's past violent behavior was a key component in their case, reinforcing the idea that Fawn's death was not a random act of violence, but a product of his simmering rage. Ferguson's defense, however, was focused on discrediting the prosecution's narrative. His legal team argued that there was no direct evidence linking Ferguson to the murder. They tried to introduce doubt about the forensic evidence, suggesting that it was not conclusive enough to secure a conviction. Ferguson's lawyers attempted to paint him as an innocent man who was a victim of a rushed investigation. Throughout the trial, Ferguson's behavior was cold and distant. He sat at the defense table, arms crossed, his face often stoic and emotionless. There were few moments when he appeared to show any remorse for the pain he had caused. His eyes were often cast downward, but it was unclear whether this was out of guilt or simply a defense mechanism. He did react when the most damning evidence was presented. There was no indication that he understood the gravity of his actions. As the trial concluded and the jury deliberated, the community held its collective breath. The evidence was overwhelming, and it seemed like a foregone conclusion that Ferguson would be found guilty. After what felt like an eternity, the verdict came in guilty. There was a collective sigh of relief in the courtroom, though it was tempered by the immense sorrow that had been carried throughout the trial. Fawn's family, though pleased with the verdict, knew that no verdict could bring their beloved daughter back. Ferguson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a decision that many felt was fitting, though it could never fill the void left by Fawn's loss. Fawn's life was taken too soon and the scars remain. Don't let her story fade into the shadows. Hit subscribe, and let's continue to share her memory and spread awareness about the horrors of abuse. The death of Fawn O'Neill left an unhealable wound in the hearts of her family, particularly her mother, Jessica. The grief was overwhelming, and Jessica found herself haunted by the weight of the loss every day. Losing her daughter in such a violent and senseless way was something no parent should ever have to endure. But for Jessica, the pain was compounded by the fact that the man responsible for Fawn's death had once been someone she trusted, someone she loved. The emotional toll on Jessica was immense. In the wake of Fawn's death and the subsequent legal proceedings, Jessica struggled to come to terms with the idea that Ferguson, her boyfriend, had been the one to take Fawn's life. There were moments when Jessica blamed herself, wondering if she had done something to prevent it, if she had seen the warning signs earlier. The guilt and regret weighed heavily on her, and even though she knew in her heart that she had been manipulated and trapped in an abusive relationship, the shame lingered. Despite the intense grief, Jessica also made efforts to honor her daughter's memory. She would often visit Fawn's grave, sitting by her daughter's resting place, reflecting on the beautiful moments they had shared together. Jessica's love for Fawn didn't end with her death. It was channeled into a desire to ensure her daughter's story was heard. She spoke out about the dangers of abusive relationships, especially those involving children, and how easily manipulation could trap someone in a cycle of violence. The loss was not just felt by Jessica. Fawn's extended family and friends, who had watched her grow, also struggled to cope with the tragedy. Many of them, like Jessica, felt a sense of powerlessness. They wished they had noticed the signs of abuse or had been able to intervene before it was too late. In Fawn's honor, they organized memorials and fundraisers to raise awareness about domestic violence and child abuse. Her family's grief was intense, but was accompanied by a collective effort to keep Fawn's spirit alive for the advocacy of causes that could help prevent future tragedies. The public reaction to Fawn's death was one of deep shock and disbelief. The case seemed almost unreal. How could something so horrific happen in a quiet community? Fawn was the epitome of innocence, and the idea that such a young child's life could be snatched away by the very person who was supposed to protect her left everyone reeling. In the aftermath of the crime, there was an outpouring of support for Jessica and the family. The community rallied around them, offering condolences and emotional support. Local churches held prayer vigils, and citizens donated to memorial funds in honor of Fawn's memory. The small town that had once been so peaceful now found itself united in grief, with the weight of the tragedy affecting everyone who had known Fawn. The case sparked important conversations about domestic violence, child abuse, and the signs of an unhealthy, dangerous relationship. People began to openly discuss how easily an abusive partner can manipulate and control their victim, especially when children are involved. The idea that someone could go from being a seemingly loving partner to a cold-blooded murderer was something the community could not easily reconcile, but it ignited a fire for change. While Fawn's death could never be undone, her case did lead to some changes within the legal system and society. The trial and its aftermath spurred local lawmakers and advocacy groups to take a closer look at how domestic violence and child abuse cases were handled. In particular, the case led to more stringent laws regarding child protection, and there was a renewed effort to make resources more accessible for victims of domestic abuse. One of the changes sparked by Fawn's death was the implementation of stronger protocols for the investigation of domestic violence-related crimes, particularly those that involved children. Local law enforcement agencies began to invest more in training officers to recognize the subtle signs of abuse and how to better protect children from becoming victims. The tragic loss of Fawn opened the eyes of many to the complexities of abusive relationships and how easily children could be caught in the crossfire. In addition to changes in law enforcement, advocacy groups began to lobby for greater support for survivors of domestic violence and their children. Fawn's case became a touchstone for these organizations, fueling campaigns aimed at providing better shelter, legal aid, and counseling services for victims. These groups worked tirelessly to ensure that Fawn's death wouldn't be forgotten, using her story to push for reform in areas that had been neglected for too long. Fawn's life may have been tragically cut short, but her story lives on in the fight against domestic violence and child abuse. Hit subscribe to continue supporting the cause and spreading awareness about the dangers that lurk behind closed doors. Fawn O'Neill's death was a tragedy that could have been prevented. A life so full of promise, taken too soon by someone who should have protected her. As we reflect on her story, we are left to ask ourselves, how could this tragedy have been prevented? What signs did we miss? And what can we do differently to protect children like Fawn from abuse? Fawn's story is not just one of heartbreak, but a reminder of the vulnerabilities children face when abuse is allowed to continue unchecked. We must ask ourselves, how can we create a society where children are safe and protected from the horrors that Fawn suffered? What changes need to be made in our communities, our homes, and our systems to ensure that no child has to endure the same fate? If you believe stories like Fawn's need to be heard, hit the like button, subscribe for more, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Every voice matters in spreading awareness about domestic violence and child abuse. Let's work together to make sure Fawn's story is not forgotten and that we're all part of the solution. By not subscribing, you're choosing to ignore stories like Fawn's. Don't let this be just another statistic. If you care about justice for children, hit subscribe. Otherwise, leave a comment telling us why you won't stand with her memory. Fawn's story will never be forgotten, and we must keep her memory alive by speaking out against abuse. Let her life, her innocence, and her legacy fuel the change we need. Let's promise that no child will ever be left to suffer like she did.